So I'm going to do a reading from the book On Anarchism, Noam Chomsky. It's selected interviews. I'm going to do Chapter 4, interview with Harry Kresler from Political Awakenings, March 22, 2002. And Harry is asking Noam, how do you think your parents shaped your perspectives on the world? And Noam's answer is, those are always very hard questions because it's a combination of influence and resistance, which is difficult to sort out. My parents were immigrants, and they happened to end up in Philadelphia as part of what amounted to kind of a Hebrew ghetto, Jewish ghetto in Philadelphia. Not a physical ghetto, it was scattered around the city, but a cultural ghetto. When my father's family came over for whatever reason, they went to Baltimore, and my mother's family, from another part of the Pale of Settlement, came to New York. The families were totally different. The Baltimore family was ultra-Orthodox. In fact, my father told me that they had become more Orthodox when they got here than they even were in the Ukraine where they came from. In general, there was a tendency among some sectors of immigrants to intensify the cultural tradition, probably as a way of identifying themselves in a strange environment, I suppose. The other part of the family, my mother's, was mainly Jewish working class, very radical. The Jewish element had disappeared. This was the 1930s, so they were part of the ferment of radical activism that was going on in all sorts of ways. Of all of them, the one that actually did influence me a great deal was an uncle by marriage who came into the family when I was about 7 or 8. He had grown up in a poor area of New York. In fact, he himself never went past 4th grade, on the streets and with a criminal background and all the things that were going on in the underclass ghettos in New York. He happened to have a physical deformity, so he was able to get a newsstand under a compensation program that was run in the 1930s for people with disabilities. He had a newsstand on 72nd Street in New York and lived nearby in a little apartment. I spent a lot of time there. That newsstand became an intellectual center for emigres from Europe. Lots of Germans and other emigres were coming. He wasn't a very educated person formally. Like I said, he never went past 4th grade, but maybe the most educated person I've ever met, self-educated. The newsstand itself was a very lively intellectual center, professors of this and that arguing all night. And working at the newsstand was a lot of fun. I went for years thinking that there's a newspaper called News and Mirror, because people came out of the subway station and raced past the newsstand. They would say, News and Mirror, and I gave them 2 tabloids, which I later discovered were the News and the Mirror. And I noticed that as soon as they picked up the News and Mirror, the first thing they opened to was the sports page. So this is an 8-year-old's picture of the world. There were newspapers there, but that wasn't all there was. That was the background of the discussions that were going on. Through my uncle and other influences, I got myself involved in the ongoing 30s radicalism, and it was very much part of the Hebrew-based, Zionist-oriented, this is Palestine, pre-Israel, Palestine-oriented life, and that was a good part of my life. I became a Hebrew teacher like my parents and a Zionist youth leader, combining it with the radical activism in various ways. Actually, that's the way I got into linguistics. Interviewer, you actually wrote your first essay as a 10-year-old on the Spanish Civil War. Well, like you said, I was 10 years old. I'm sure I would not want to read it today. I remember what it was about because I remember what struck me. This was right after the fall of Barcelona. The fascist forces had conquered Barcelona, and that was essentially the end of the Spanish Civil War. And the article was about the spread of fascism around Europe. So it started off by talking about Munich and Barcelona and the spread of the Nazi power, fascist power, which was extremely frightening. Just to add a little word of personal background, we happened to be, for most of my childhood, the only Jewish family in a mostly Irish and German Catholic neighborhood, sort of a lower middle-class neighborhood, which was very anti-Semitic and quite pro-Nazi. It's obvious why the Irish would be. They hated the British. It's not surprising the Germans were anti-Semitic. I can remember beer parties when Paris fell, and the sense of the threat of this black cloud spreading over Europe was very frightening. I could pick up my mother's attitudes particularly. She was terrified by it. It was also in my personal life because I saw the streets. Interesting, for some reason, which I do not understand to this day. My brother and I never talked to our parents about it. I don't think they knew that we were living in an anti Semitic neighborhood. But on the streets, you go out and play ball with kids or try to walk to the bus or something. It was a constant threat. It was just the kind of thing you knew for some reason not to talk to your parents about. To this day of their death, they didn't know, but there was this combination of knowing that this cloud was spreading over the world and picking up particularly that my mother was very upset about it. My father too, but more constrained, and living it in the streets in my own daily life that made it very real. Anyhow, by the late 30s, I did become quite interested in Spanish anarchism and the Spanish Civil War, where all of this was being fought out at the time. Right before the World War broke out, a kind of microcosm was going on in Spain. By the time I was old enough to get on a train by myself, around 10 or 11, I would go to New York for a weekend and stay with my aunt and uncle and hang around at anarchist bookstores down around Union Square and 4th Avenue. There were little bookstores with emigres, really interesting people. To my mind, they looked about 90. They were maybe in their 40s or something, and they were very interested in young people. They wanted young people to come along, so they spent a lot of attention. Talking to these people was a real education. Harry, the interviewer, these experiences we've described, you were saying they led you into linguistics, but also led you into your view of politics and of the world. You're a libertarian anarchist, and when one hears that, because of the way issues are framed in this country, there are many misperceptions. Help us understand what that means. Noam, the United States is sort of out of the world on this topic. Here, the term libertarian means the opposite of what it always meant in history. Libertarian throughout modern European history meant socialist anarchist. It meant the anti-state element of the workers' movement and the socialist movement. Here, it means ultra-conservative Ayn Rand or Cato Institute or something like that. But that's a special U.S. usage. There are a lot of things quite special about the way the U.S. developed, and this is part of it. In Europe, it meant, and always meant to me, an anti-state branch of socialism, which meant a highly organized society, nothing to do with chaos, but based on democracy all the way through. That means democratic control of communities, of workplaces, of federal structures, built on systems of voluntary association spreading internationally. That's traditional anarchism. Anybody can have the word if they like, but that's the mainstream of traditional anarchism. And it has roots. Coming back to the U.S., it has very strong roots in the American working class movements. So if you go back to, say, the 1850s, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, right around the area where I live in eastern Massachusetts, in the textile plants and so on, the people working on those plants were in part young women coming off the farm. They were called factory girls, the women from the farms who worked in the textile plants. Some of them were Irish, immigrants in Boston, and that group of people. They had an extremely rich and interesting culture. They're kind of like my uncle, who never went past 4th grade. Very educated, reading modern literature. They didn't bother with European radicalism. That had no effect on them, but they were very much a part of the general literary culture. And they developed their own conceptions of how the world ought to be organized. They had their own newspapers. In fact, the period of the freest press in the U.S. was probably around the 1850s. In the 1850s, the scale of the popular press, meaning run by factory girls in Lowell and so on, was on the scale of the commercial press or even greater. These were independent newspapers that arose spontaneously without any background. The writers had never heard of Marx or Buchanan or anyone else, yet they developed the same ideas. From their point of view, what they called wage slavery, renting yourself to an owner, was not very different from the chattel slavery that they were fighting a civil war about. So the idea of renting yourself, meaning working for wages, was degrading. It was an attack on your personal integrity. They despised the industrial system that was developing, that was destroying their culture, destroying their independence, their individuality, constraining them to be subordinate to masters. There was a tradition of what was called republicanism in the U.S. We're free people, the first free people in the world. This was destroying and undermining that freedom. This was the core of the labor movement all over, and included in it was the assumption, just taken for granted, that those who work in the mills should own them. In fact, one of their main slogans was a condemnation of what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self. That new spirit that you should only be interested in gaining wealth and forgetting about your relations to other people, they regarded it as a violation of fundamental human nature and a degrading idea. That was a strong, rich American culture which was crushed by violence. The U.S. has a very violent labor history, much more so than Europe. It was wiped out over a long period with extreme violence. By the time it picked up again in the 1930s, that's when I personally came into the tail end of it. After the Second World War, it was crushed. By now, it's forgotten, but it's very real. I don't really think it's forgotten. I think it's just below the surface in people's consciousness. Harry, the interviewer, you examine in your work the extent to which histories and traditions are forgotten. To define a new position often means going back and finding those older traditions. Gnomes, things like this are forgotten in the intellectual culture, but my feeling is they're alive in the popular culture, in people's sentiments and attitudes and understandings and so on. I know when I talk to, say, working class audiences today, and I talk about these ideas, they seem very natural to them. It's true, nobody talks about them, but when you bring up the idea that you have to rent yourself to somebody and follow their orders and that they own and you work, you built it, but you don't own it, that's a highly unnatural notion. You don't have to study any complicated theories to see that this is an attack on human dignity. Harry, the interviewer. So, coming out of this tradition, being influenced by and continuing to believe in, what is your notion of legitimate power? Under what circumstances is power legitimate? The core of the anarchist tradition, as I understand it, is that power is always illegitimate unless it proves itself to be legitimate. So the burden of proof is always on those who claim that some authoritarian hierarchic relation is legitimate. If they can't prove it, then it should be dismantled. Can you ever prove it? Well, it's a heavy burden of proof to bear, but I think sometimes you can bear it. So to take an example, if I'm walking down the street with my 4-year-old granddaughter and she starts to run into the street and I grab her arm and pull her back, that's an exercise of power and authority, but I can give a justification for it, and it's obvious what the justification would be. And maybe there are other cases where you can justify it. But the question that always should be asked uppermost in our mind is, why should I accept it? It's the responsibility of those who exercise power to show that somehow it's legitimate. It's not the responsibility of anyone else to show that it's illegitimate. It's illegitimate by assumption, if it's a relation of authority among human beings which places some above others. Unless you can give a strong argument to show that it's right, you've lost. It's kind of like the use of violence, say, in international affairs. There's a very heavy burden of proof to be borne by anyone who calls for violence. Maybe it can be sometimes justified. Personally, I'm not a committed pacifist, so I think that, yes, it can be justified. So I thought, in fact, in that article I wrote in 4th grade, I thought the West should be using force to try to stop fascism, and I still think so. But now I know a lot more about it. I know that the West was actually supporting fascism, supporting Franco, supporting Mussolini, and so on, and even Hitler. I didn't know that at the time, but I thought then and I think now that the use of force to stop that plague would have been legitimate and finally was legitimate. But an argument has to be given for it. I think I'll stop there.